Right, hello, good morning, and welcome to Elevenses. I'm Kevin Williams of Survival Skills Rider Training. This is show number 279. It's Sunday, the 16th of October. It's a lovely sunny morning here in London at the moment, and this is a recording after the live show went awry some 20 minutes ago. So I will hopefully get a good, clean recording and get this uploaded as soon as I have actually finished talking. So, with no further ado, on with the content of today's show. What have we got for you? Well, a bike has been seized after a rider stunted in front of a police car with no license. A good Samaritan spent hours trying to report the stolen bike on the 101 line. 1,000 people rushed to a Phnom Penh police warehouse to recover their stolen bikes. South Korea has launched an investigation into emission cheating on motorcycles, which sounds familiar, doesn't it? The re-released Norton Commando 961 has 350 upgraded parts. Zundaf, the well-known German motorcycle manufacturer, could be back with a new machine, but the Belgian startup Solid, I think the Netherlands, actually, the Dutch, have a rather new and I would say uncomfortable angle on the e-bike. But if EVs are too modern for you, how about steam? I've got an interesting link to a steam motorcycle. And then finally, today's discussion point, the Motorcycle Action Group have released their position paper on the government's consultation on autonomous vehicle trials on public roads. And I'll be discussing that and my point of view on the topic at the end of the show. So stay tuned for the next 30 minutes or so while we get to that particular story. So first thing to say, thank you very much for looking in on the webcast on Wednesday night. If you did so, it's quite an interesting one. I think it was all about the difference between visibility and conspicuity, absolutely vital understanding for us riders, to be honest, and how sometimes our conspicuous gear can actually turn out to be camouflage. So if you missed that, shame, but hopefully you'll be around for the next event in November, which is going to be how we can utilize sports psychology to improve our riding without even going anywhere near a motorcycle. So those are my live events, first Wednesday of the month, generally speaking. Do look for those online. The link is in the preamble. I need to put the booking link actually up for the second one, so I'll try to remember to do that later today. Right, okay, so anyway, don't forget, if you've got anything you want to say, comment, questions about the show, feedback generally, I'm always interested to hear it. Just drop it off into the comment stream and I will get back to you obviously after the show today, as I'm not live right this moment. But normally when I'm live, I do try to answer people as I go along. Now, the previous show mentioned a couple of bikers who'd attracted police attention. One by attempting to place a hand over his number plate as he sped past a camera. Another who rode an unregistered bike helmetless on the pavement. It seems that some riders simply can't help themselves when it comes to doing things in front of an audience. And this particular rider was actually caught riding a motorcycle standing. He was hands up, hands off the bars. He was seen to be weaving in and out of traffic, and he was also speeding on the A46 in Warwickshire. So plenty to attract attention. Unfortunately, amongst the drivers whose attention he attracted, there turned out to be police in an unmarked car. So just to add to his pain, having stopped him, they discovered he didn't actually have a license to ride this Honda either. So he was his bike was seized. He was reported for speeding and he was reported for license offences. The police also said that he would need to produce the correct documents to get the bike back, which implies it wasn't insured either. And Warwickshire Police concluded their statement by saying they'd advised him to come see us for a bike safe course when he passes his full motorcycle test. So, of course, if you do want to attract police attention in a good way, sometimes it seems next to impossible. For example, The person who was trying to inform the authorities about this dumped scooter, they were standing next to the bike for 2 hours and no police had arrived. Apparently, it took 4 hours before 101 actually answered. Now, one suggestion was to put it on social media, and in fact, you can see that that's where it actually ended up. As the fastest way to reunite the bike with its rider. Another suggested putting a lock on the machine to prevent the thieves from recovering it themselves later. One service which I hadn't actually heard of is the website isitnicked.com, which allows for a free check against the police database of whether or not a vehicle is actually stolen. So that's quite, as I say, that's a new one on me. Isitnicked.com. I can't post it in the comments, which I was just trying to do because, of course, I'm not live online at the moment. I'm recording. So do have a look over there. Now, it happens whilst I was out training in Lincolnshire last month, we rounded a corner to discover the road covered in potatoes. Now, when I wrote up the course on Facebook, somebody promptly asked if I'd reported the hazard. Well, the answer was no, I hadn't. And I was mildly chastised for not doing so because it could be potentially dangerous to motorcyclists. Now, yeah, frankly, he's correct. Obviously running over a mashed potato is going to be a bit slippery, but frankly, it's probably less of a hazard to a halfway switched on biker than discovering the road actually lacks a surface just where we need one the most. The modern trend is less road and more pothole. But basically, my prior experience of trying to report issues myself, which included coming across a street light which had been knocked down and was partly blocking a lane, and also discovering a missing manhole cover which had left an 18-inch hole in the middle of the elevated section of the A40 in West London. That was right in the middle of the day, that one. Were less than successful. I remember spending quite some considerable time trying to get somebody to actually take a note of what I was trying to report. So I'm afraid the spuds were abandoned to look after themselves. Now, theft, of course, is a problem around the world, and in Phnom Penh, the capital of Cambodia, around 1,000 people rushed to this police warehouse as authorities released 234 recovered motorcycles and scooters back to their owners. Now, this massive seizure was the result of police raids on pawn shops, which have apparently been acquiring the vehicles from bike thieves operating in the capital. This is the first phase of the operation. There are apparently another 600 bikes still being processed. So not too surprisingly, proper documentation is being required before these bikes are being released back to their owners. And police are actually warning the pawn shop operators to actually operate within the law or face the consequences. So theft wherever you go is a problem when it comes to motorcycles. And something else that's a problem with motorcycles are emissions. Now, South Korea's government announced on Tuesday this week that it's actually launching an investigation into allegations that Chinese motorcycles are being imported without going through the process of exhaust emissions certification. As I mentioned in a previous show some months back, South Korea is attempting to reduce vehicle emissions significantly in a number of cities, and older motorcycles have been a target for this. But this investigation is actually aimed at more recent models imported from a number of countries, mostly from China. Here is what is suspected to have happened. The member companies of the Korea Import Motorcycle Environment Association can import a low volume, up to 500 bikes, of motorcycles, so long as they have the same certification as a model where a single bike has actually gained the certification. So one bike gets tested, presumably 499, then are given a pass certificate. Now, it's alleged that what's been happening is that some companies have been getting their sample model certificated, possibly by manipulating the bike's ECU software to modify the exhaust emissions for the test. But then the rest of that batch that are imported fail to meet the sample model's specification. And to give you an idea of the scale of the problem, the ministry says that 97,716 motorcycles have been imported from other countries, including China, under this scheme over the last decade. And that means that the vast majority of those may have dodged the exhaust emissions certification. Now, back home in the UK, a bike which hopefully has now less problems than it had before is the Norton Commando 961. The company's new owners have now re-released the model, and it's been doing the rounds of road tests, and so far has been given a clean bill of health. Now, you'll probably notice that the machine looks almost identical to the version that first appeared back in 2010 during the Stuart Garner era. But under Norton's newest owners, the huge Indian conglomerate TVS Motors, Norton's current management are keen to point out that the new model fixes everything that was wrong with the original machine. Now, as the original bike was produced, many orders were left simply unfulfilled, and the bikes that were delivered suffered poor build quality. How it looks was never the problem, said John Hogan. He's Norton's new head of communications. But he said, we've completely re-engineered the Commando from top to bottom, which is what had to happen. You can't see the amount of work that's gone into the transmission, for example. On the old version, there were a lot of issues and sometimes not as many gears as there should have been. It's been entirely reworked. If you line up both bikes next to each other, you'd probably struggle to tell what's going on. But if you could turn them inside out, you'd notice it immediately. Christian Gladwell, who is Norton's chief commercial officer, he tells the same story. He says, we've spent 2 years and countless millions in taking over 350 parts. And though they look the same, making them out of better materials and to a far higher level, he said. Now, upside down forks aside, which I always think sort of ruin the looks of a classic machine, I always thought the original Commando was a nice looking bike, but the new bike I think is absolutely gorgeous. Certainly wouldn't miss one in my garage if I had one. The black and white pinstriping model, black and gold I should say, pinstriping, I think is absolutely stunning. Unfortunately, they're out of my price range, so unlikely that one will be in my garage anytime soon. Now, another classic brand that you probably have heard of is Zundaf. They were the famous German brand, and they interestingly had their roots in munitions manufacture all the way back in World War I before they diversified into motorcycle construction in 2019 with their Z22 model just after the war ended. But the original company collapsed back in 1984. The production of Zundaf motorcycles actually topped 100,000 a year just 10 years after that company was born, so in 1929 that would be. The company developed 400cc and 500cc flat twin machines, and they even built a highly rated 800 flat 4. But after World War II, Zundaf switched to mass transport, and they focused entirely on smaller capacity machines. Now, interestingly, Zundaf actually bucked the trend, and they discontinued their development of four-stroke engines after 1958, and they only produced small capacity two-stroke models, including a range of the popular 16er specials with pedals. And this, for example, is the KS 50 from 1978, and if you look closely you'll see in fact that you do have a pedal with a crank on it. If you haven't ever come across these 16er specials, they could in theory be cycled along using those pedals, but in road going mode what they had was a lock on the crank, so one pedal would be swung down so that they would basically line up with each other rather than being one up one down like they are on a bicycle, and they would lock into place so you could use the foot pegs and the as normal and use the brake lever and the gear shift. These little beasts are actually capable of fairly remarkable performance. You'd get 50 or so out of one of these, I would guess. They certainly used to get 50 plus out of some of the 16er specials. Not too surprisingly, legislation came in across Europe and they were all banned from 1982. And that meant Zundaf's significant income stream dried up. And by 1984, the company actually went bankrupt. Now, after the bankruptcy, the entire production line and the intellectual property of the company was bought by the Zundaf Motor Company of China, and they produced small Zundaf badge motorcycles from 1987 through to the early 90s. Now, Zundaf also apparently had a technical collaboration with Royal Enfield to build mopeds and lightweight two-stroke motorcycles at a dedicated factory near Madras. That's now Chennai, of course. And that was in the early 1980s, just before the company went under. But they apparently weren't very successful from the sales point of view either. So Zundaf returned to German ownership as recently as 2017, when it was bought by Dieter Neumeier, who is actually the grandson of the founder Fritz Ludwig Neumeier. Now, since they've been focused on selling e-bicycles, e-scooters, plus one budget-priced internal combustion engine scooter, the company sprang a bit of a surprise at the Cologne motorcycle show, the Intermot show, last week, when they released this particular model. It's the Zxa Adventure 500. It's a prototype, to be true, but it does look pretty close to production. And also, particularly from the front, it looks remarkably similar to Ducati's Multistrada. But as you probably guessed, it doesn't get a Ducati engine. Instead, the motive power is a Chinese-built 476 inline twin motor producing 35 kilowatts, which is bang on the 37 horsepower limit for A2 license holders. The water-cooled fuel-injected motor is apparently a copy of Honda's 500, presumably under license. Twin overhead cam, 4 valves per cylinder, 6-speed gearbox. It's Euro 5 compliant, and the fuel consumption is claimed to be 4 litres per 100 kilometres, or around 70 mpg if you think that way. That's the way I do, I have to admit. The machine comes with a now standard inverted front fork. It gets a monoshock rear, 17-inch wire spoked wheels with pretty chunky looking spokes actually, 3 pedal discs with radially mounted calipers, and you get ABS. Now, as well as all that, the machine comes with full LED lights, TFT color display, twin USB chargers, so all the bells and whistles there. The screen goes up and down. Seat height is a reasonable 800 millimeters, which is 31.5 inches. It's about half an inch higher than my XJ6, so not the highest of seats, not the lowest either. And depending on which report I was reading, and I read several, the panniers and the crash bars are either optional extras or they're standard. I'd hope they come as fitted. And interestingly, despite the 18-litre or 4-gallon tank, the bike weighs in at 196 kilograms, which is 432 pounds. Now, one press report called it heavy, but actually that's quite significantly lighter than some of the Chinese-based competition, like the Benelli TRK 502, for example, which is the best-selling bike in Italy, or the Vosges 500 DS, which is another similar machine. The Benelli actually flattens the scales to the tune of 213 kilograms or 470 pounds. So being actually 40 pounds lighter is actually pretty significant. It's actually even 3 kilograms lighter than the Honda CBX 500, according to the specs that have been given out. Now, right now, the bike, as I say, is still prototype, but it does look pretty close to finished. And one report suggests that a price of around €7,500 has already been set for the machine, and that's around £6,500 at current exchange rates. Now, whether that will be enough to be competitive to carve a niche in what is an increasingly competitive and crowded market, particularly when the bike is up against the Honda, will remain to be seen. There's no word if it's coming to the UK as yet, but it is an attractive looking variation on the highly practical adventure bike theme. And I dare say that carrying the Zundaf name, it may well turn out to be popular in Germany. However, I would have to say that this particular machine is neither attractive nor an attractive proposition for a rider. This is actually a bike called the Solid CRS01, and it's designed by a Belgian-based studio for a Dutch startup, Solid EV. Now, explaining the concept behind the Solid CRS01, the design team at Voyager Co. wrote, we took a highly modular product-like approach using cost-effective materials such as sheet metal to build a self-supporting monocoque frame, also doubling as the exterior panels of the motorcycle. Now, monocoque construction is nothing new, of course, but it is rather unusual for a motorcycle, but the sharp and angular edges don't go generally hand in hand with rider comfort. That's the reason that most motorcycles actually have fairly rounded edges. Meanwhile, you might think from the dropped bars, if I can just zoom in a little bit on the front of the motorcycle there, you'll see what I'm talking about. Whoops, that's the wrong photo. That's a skipped back one. There we go. They're fairly radical dropped bars there. You might be expecting the bike to have a big battery and a powerful motor and be actually capable of a decent top speed. Unfortunately, you would be completely wrong. The bike is actually limited to just 45 kph, which is 28 miles per hour, which makes it a moped, and you'll get between 80 to 140 kilometers, which roughly translates to 50 to 100 miles. But frankly, I would imagine that clip-on based riding position would be torture at 28 miles per hour, and with that seat and that tank digging into you painfully, I would imagine that you'd run out of patience with the machine long before you run out of juice. Now, I will put the link up later, but if you think that EVs or petrol engines are a little bit too modern for you, how about a steam motorcycle? I just play the link when you get a moment. I think the bike sounds absolutely amazing. I just love the sound of the steam engine chuffing along. But I suspect the bike probably won't pass tailpipe emissions. Right, okay, don't forget, you can, if you want to, support me over on Coffee. £3 over there, it buys me a cuppa, and it buys you a month's access to 800 better biking articles. So well worth your time and money, I would think. Do go over there and have a look. There is plenty of free product over there, as it were, to get your teeth into, to so tell whether or not you fancy actually becoming a supporter or even a regular subscriber, which will open up access to even more content. Now, before I get into the final segment, a sip of my tea. Now, as I reported in ELEVENSES 265, which was on Sunday, the 21st of August, the government set out their timetable for the rollout of self-driving vehicles on UK roads. It'll be appearing as early as 2025, with trials on motorways actually starting next year. Now, naturally, we weren't given long to gather our thoughts, just 2 months, in fact. And the public consultation, which asked for views on these proposed safety standards for these self-driving vehicles, actually closed on Friday. Now, whether the consultation was launched to coincide with the summer holidays in order for a potentially controversial proposal to fly under the radar, I couldn't possibly say. But there does seem to have been a very muted response, probably because it's been overshadowed by the death of the Queen, of course, but also the antics of the ongoing clown show that passes for the UK government right now. Now, even riders' rights group, the Motorcycle Action Group, MAG, who are generally all over anything that potentially impacts motorcyclists, were pretty late in responding to this. Their initial statement from the government was along the lines of that since self-driving technology cannot be 100% safe, that's a quote from them, an acceptable level of performance for self-driving vehicles would be to be as safe as, quote, a competent and careful human driver. So competent and careful, what does that mean? Well, MAG's response rejected that as a proposed standard, as calling it far too subjective. Director of Campaigns and Political Engagement Colin Brown called the target incongruous and said, I quite like this quote actually, you wouldn't send a rocket to the moon whilst saying hopefully it will end up somewhere in the vicinity of the moon. But I agree with him. That's effectively what we're doing. When a sort of moonshot is made, the thing lands within meters of where it's designed to land. This is basically a moonshot with no idea where it's going to end up. Now, the first trials will actually be on motorways where, of course, cyclists and pedestrians are excluded. So Colin also makes a very valid point when he says motorcyclists face being the first vulnerable road user group that will interact with self-driving vehicles. And the MAG press release concludes, self-driving technology should be developed to benefit humanity. We see no sense in forcing humanity to adapt to fit in with any of its shortcomings. If these vehicles cannot safely interact with us as human riders, then they have no place being rolled out. I concur with that. It was pretty much what I said 2 months ago when I first investigated the problem. Now, this is how I look at this basically. As I keep reminding readers and viewers here on my web pages and here on my live webcasts, we're all competent and careful drivers and riders right up till the moment we crash. And the fact is, and this is important and it's relevant, the vast majority of road traffic collisions do not involve the kind of biker I mentioned at the top of the show, riding along, standing up on the pegs, not holding the bars, weaving in and out of traffic and speeding. The vast majority of us are not doing that when things go wrong. Most of us ride with enough competency or drive with enough competency and with enough care for us to stay upright and out of trouble for the vast majority of our working lives. Most people never have a serious crash. And the same applies to four-wheel operators too, drivers, exactly the same. But every now and again, any of us can find ourselves in a set of circumstances that we didn't foresee, that we've not experienced before, and that we didn't have time to figure out in order to use our skills to stay out of trouble. Now, of course, having had a crash or maybe even just a near miss, if we have any kind of self-awareness and assuming we actually survived the incident, which is always a problem, we use our abilities to review what happened to determine what we should have done in the circumstances, and thus we change our behavior in order to avoid making the same mistake twice. Well, most of us do, and most of us do in fact learn from our errors. Now, essentially, if you read between the lines, the proposal for the autonomous vehicles is in fact for those vehicles to be learning from their mistakes as they go along. So the public roads will end up being used as a test bed for immature technology. Now, is that good enough is the question. I would say it definitely isn't. Now, back in August, I reported that the BBC had been in contact with the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation, and they had said it might not be enough for self-driving cars to be safer than normal cars. It says the public may have little tolerance for driverless car crashes, even if they are safer on average. And again, I think that's likely to be completely true. We don't want an autonomous car to be just a little bit safer than an average driver. We want them to be much, much safer than an average driver. And that's at least partly, of course, because the way that drivers and riders too are consistently blamed for committing human error. And because the benefits of driverless vehicles have been pushed, and the benefit has always been argued to be the fact that by removing the human from the equation, you remove human error. So people will expect them to be perfect. Many, myself included, see the aims simply to match human drivers as a tacit admission of the failure of these vehicles to have adequate programming to use the roads. Now, back in August, I also reported the government is investing in self-driving vehicles to the tune of 100 million, 34 million of which is going to be used on safety issues such as how these self-driving cars perform in poor weather conditions and how they interact with pedestrians, other vehicles and cyclists. Now, some people will no doubt think 100 million, that's a lot of cash. Well, it's a derisory amount. Tesla spent almost 1.5 billion US dollars in 2020 alone on research and development. And although that obviously covers all areas of research and development, they are just a single manufacturer. And as I also reported 2 months ago, Tesla have published data claiming to show that their cars are safer on autopilot, and that data is based on crashes per mile. But when I actually looked at this, what I found was that the vast majority of miles clocked up by Teslas, over 90% of those miles, are on what are termed controlled access roads. That is freeways, the US equivalent of motorway, where you can only enter and leave at a limited number of access points, and traffic flowing in opposite directions is separated by a physical barrier. Now, the fact is that these roads naturally have considerably fewer collisions per mile, whether you drive them in the US or the UK. But they took that data from relatively low risk roads and then compared it with all crashes on all types of roads from ordinary cars. And that's how they got their safer than human figures. But when you trim out the non-freeway crashes from the human driven mileage, the Tesla's autopilot turns out to be rather less safe than the human driver. So the autonomous element is only going to be as good as the programmer's imagination and the data that has already been collected by the vehicles as they have been driven and trialed. So if a vehicle doesn't experience a particular issue in a particular way, and the programmer hasn't perhaps thought of that, and the vehicle hasn't previously experienced it, then there will be no strategy to deal with that issue. There can be some general sort of catch-alls, which when you read about some of the strange things that EVs do, where they just sort of stop unexpectedly, then that may be what's happening. But ultimately, it means that the EV has to be reprogrammed to deal with that novel situation. So the fact is that these vehicles are actually learning from errors. And that means the rest of us who are going to be sharing the roads with them are actually guinea pigs too. It's not just the AVs that are on trial, it's us interacting with those vehicles. And of course, we are also at risk. Not potentially at risk, we are genuinely at risk, particularly if we're on a motorcycle, I would say. And that's why these EVs should be better than humans right from the very off, not as good as, they should be superior. And that is where my position aligns completely with Mags on this particular topic. Right, that is it for today. Sorry about the recording. I do apologize for that. Hopefully we can get that issue sorted out. It's happened a couple of times in the recent weeks, which is very, very irritating indeed. I don't know where the problem lies. I don't think it's at my end. I do think it is probably at the other end, but and if that's the case, there's nothing much I can do about it. Anyway, that is it for today. Thank you again for tuning in to Elevenses. I'm Kevin Williams of Survival Skills, and if you are out there riding today, do stay shiny side up.